round off with a little bit of looking at what OSCR's inquiry work is actually like in practice. So I'm going to provide you with just a little bit of insight about what our inquiry work really looks like day to day to try and help your understanding of what happens once we receive a concern about a charity. We often find that there are a whole range of kind of misconceptions about this part of our role. So hopefully you're going to find this interesting and hopefully useful. So I'd like to start off with being clear about what it isn't like. Now, it isn't like Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes here, doing an immense amount of cogitating and wandering around in his deer stalker. What else isn't it like? It's not like the police, contrary to popular belief again. It is entirely fair, however, to say that we do think an awful lot about what we do. We take our time to make sure that we're getting the right conclusions and the right outcomes. And of course, our work involves more than just one or two people. But the reality is actually very different from either of these suggests, despite the impression that exists in many people's minds. So, Kenny referred earlier to the kind of initial risk assessment process that we go through when we are first looking at a concern that comes into us. Now, that assessment process is designed to help us gauge the seriousness of the matter in the context of any other information at our disposal about that charity. So in the course of that initial assessment process, we're considering whether the issue is actually for OSCR to deal with. We're thinking about the severity of the issue, the evidence that's been provided to us to help us understand the concern, any other information about what's happening within the charity. Now that will include open source searching on the internet, for example, but can also include any other information that we hold as a regulator. We'll also think about whether there are any other issues that we also need to consider alongside perhaps the concern that has come to us. There might be other issues that we identify when we start to look at the other information that is available, and that might raise concerns for us, and we might think that we need to look into that quite specifically. It also helps us with prioritisation choices, and also, of course, whether there might be a need for us to take early protective action in relation to the charity and its assets. So that assessment process then results, firstly, in a decision about whether or not there is an inquiry for OSCR to actually deal with. And if there is, it will help us to give it a risk assessment marking that will aid us with allocation and prioritisation. So that's what basically happens when it first comes into us. So moving on then to the nuts and bolts of actually kind of making inquiries. Once the case has been allocated to a member of staff, now that might not happen immediately, depending on what is ahead of it in the priority queue, but once it's allocated to a member of staff, that's when our inquiry actually starts. And from there, we will reflect on how we are going to deal with the key regulatory issues and the information that we're going to need to start to gather. Now that could involve contacting the person who raised the concern with us initially, but hopefully with the new concerns form, that's likely to be needed on a decreasing basis. Where the case is maybe assessed as low risk, this usually means that the activity that subsequently happens is quite brief. There may only be a single issue, for instance, that we need to consider or to understand perhaps a little better and in a little more context by way of gathering a little bit more information to help us understand what's going on. Our low-risk cases will often conclude with us helping the charity trustees to really understand about the issue that has occurred and how they can improve the way in which they're running the charity to maybe avoid a similar issue happening again in the future. And we'll often do that with reference and signposting to guidance materials that we have available on our website. Where the case, however, is assessed perhaps as a medium or a high-risk case, the process that then follows involves us contacting the charity via the principal contact person that we have on our database, unless there's a compelling reason not to do so. For instance, if the matter of concern relates to that individual. In our opening communications, we will explain that we're opening an inquiry into that charity, and we will be very clear as to what the key regulatory issues are that we're actually interested in and that we need information about. Now, in the vast majority of cases, our interests in that inquiry will ground right back into whether those charity trustees are fulfilling their legal duties that are set out in charity law, whether their actions and the decisions that they've taken relating to the issues that we're interested in have been made in compliance with those regulatory duties. It's often the case that others expect our interest perhaps to be in what the charity's chief executive or other senior staff have done. And while that can sometimes be a feature of our work, it's very much again in the context of how the charity trustees have fulfilled their responsibilities to manage the charity overall. So from there, the inquiry process will generally involve us obtaining information and analysing it to help us understand what's happened so that we can form good, robust conclusions. And it can sometimes be the case during our inquiries that we might need to take action to deal with risks that we identify in the course of the information that we've gathered and analysed. Now, those actions, for example, could include things like freezing the charity's bank account. We could restrict the transactions that the charity is able to enter into, or we might prevent the charity from undertaking certain activities or certain transactions for a period of up to 6 months. We don't use these powers very often. Indeed, they are, I would say, relatively rare to be used, but they are all available to us in order to deal with risk and to protect charitable assets. For the majority of these powers, we're then required to publish a report to explain the action that we've taken, and that allows us to be accountable for the power that we have exercised, but it also helps members of the public to understand that there are issues within that charity that they might wish to take into account if perhaps they're deciding whether or not to engage with the charity, perhaps as a donor or a volunteer, for instance. Once we've reached our conclusions, we then have a choice to make about the most appropriate course of action to take in response. Of course, if everything has been handled just as we would expect and there are no further issues for us to consider and no improvements for us to suggest about the governance of the charity, then it might be a relatively simple exit for us. But in many, many cases, we will provide recommendations to the charity trustees about improvements that we would expect them to make to how the charity operates going forward. Now, those recommendations will be based on the understanding that we have gained about the charity throughout the inquiry process, particularly through the period that we might have been looking at where there were matters of concern and where there are potential issues that have been of interest to us throughout that period. We have a huge amount of discretion, it's fair to say, about how we deal with situations where things do go wrong. And the 2005 Act requires us to behave in line with a number of principles that we have while we're carrying out our work. And this grounds very firmly back in what Marika talked about earlier. We have to, for example, we have to act in a way that is proportionate. We need to be targeted and we need to take action where it's actually needed. In our experience, willful misconduct is rare. That's where there is a very conscious act on the part of one or more of the charity trustees to behave in a way that is very clearly contrary to their duties as charity trustees. And they are clearly aware that what they're doing is absolutely wrong. Where we do identify that kind of behaviour, we will look at the powers that we have available to us to deal with that very firmly, but equally very fairly. And our thinking often in that situation most commonly involves consideration of the need to protect charitable assets and beneficiaries, and also the potential impact on the charity sector in Scotland much more widely. But more commonly are situations where there have been failings on the part of the charity trustees in meeting their legal duties. But these haven't occurred because of a willful act or a willful decision that they've made to do wrong, but perhaps more likely because of misunderstanding on their part about what they should do or what they need to do. Maybe they've made a suboptimal choice from a range of options that were available to them, or maybe there have been weaknesses in their governance model that actually need to be addressed to support them going forward. And in these kind of situations, our approach tends to be much more about working to support the charity into a compliant position by making recommendations for improvements to their governance. Our view is very much that a facilitative approach is one that is appropriate and much, much more beneficial to the trustees and to those people that the charity is actually trying to help at the end of the day. and much more so, I would say, compared to a very punitive or a very heavy-handed approach. That approach, that heavy-handed approach, however, can sometimes be needed where we are dealing with serious misconduct on the part of charity trustees. And in those situations, there are measures that we are able to apply to the Court of Session to have exercised. The one that we've used most often, although by no means regularly, is a permanent disqualification of a person from being a charity trustee. And that again would be the subject of an inquiry report that we would publish on our website, so there'd be very much transparency around that decision and that action. Now, inquiry reports are becoming much more of a feature, I would say, of our work, as you may have noticed from our website in recent months. In addition to the requirement for us to publish an inquiry report when we exercise some of our formal powers, we also have a degree of discretion to publish a report in other situations as well. And we'll generally do that where we think the public interest warrants that decision and that behaviour, and where there are lessons from the case that we've looked at that other charities and their trustees would benefit from understanding, so that similar issues don't happen in their charity as well. We see the publication of these reports on a discretionary basis as very much a big, strong contributor to the support and the guidance that we have available for charities to understand how best to run their organisations. And we would really welcome any feedback that you have on that approach going forward, as you maybe see more and more of those coming through on our website.